Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Scrutiny Panel Meeting this evening. Councillor Gordon, who is chair of the Scrutiny Panel, has had a clash with a work commitment. So the first order of business this evening will be to elect the chair to chair this meeting. Please, can I have a nomination for chair?
I propose Councillor Hayhurst.
And a second.
I second Councillor Hayhurst for chair.
Councillor Hayhurst is elected as chair for this meeting. I now hand over the meeting to Councillor Hayhurst.
Thank you, Tracy. Tracy, since we just last spoke, I've just lost my grid view, or the mistake, so I can't see everybody easily.
Go to your the three dots.
Yeah, it's not. I've done change layout. It was fine until I just paused it to speak to you a second ago, and now I've lost everybody. There you go. I've got everyone back. Perfect. Sorry about that. Right. Just before I go through a few matters of housekeeping, the meeting is being recorded. Tracy called me a second ago to say there was a slight problem with the live stream. 3 people wanting to view it. What our IT team are doing is setting up a new link for a live stream, and they're going to post that. So hopefully those 3 people can then link into that new link to see where to watch it. I need to let you know the press are in fact watching, because I can see our local reporter Ed Sheridan here. Please can I ask you to keep your microphones on mute and only unmute when you're speaking. Can I ask meeting participants, please keep your camera on. If you'd like to speak or get my attention at the correct point, please raise your hand. I see message already popping up in the chat function. I won't be looking at that. Please use your hand to get my attention. And if somebody accidentally forgets, I will mute them. So with that, can I move on to item number 1, which is apologies for absence. Tracy, the officer, has already said in terms of Councillor Gordon, who has an important work commitment, and she sends her apologies. I also have apologies from Councillor Patrick, Ette and Billington, because they were involved in a prior decision relating to this matter. They are predetermined and hence have given their apologies. I haven't been notified of any other apologies. In terms of people that are here, I think it will probably take too long and be too arduous for everyone to unmute their microphone and say, but let me just say, I'll quickly go through. We've got Tracy Anderson, who's the officer. We've got Cllr Coban, who's on the scrutiny panel. We've got Cllr Conway on the scrutiny panel. I understand we're being joined by Councillor Steinberger on the phone. We've got Councillor Levy here. We've got Councillor Odds. We have Louise Humphreys, who's a lawyer from Hackney. We've got Mr. Richards, Mr. Ali, who both work for the London Borough of Hackney. Mr. Ali is the interim group director for neighbourhoods and housing. Mr. Richards is director of the public realm. We've got Councillor John Burke, who's responsible for energy, waste, transport and the public realm. We've got Manzila, who is IT support. We've got Miss Kirk, who is the environmental services strategy manager. We've got a Mr. or Mrs. Gold, who I'm afraid I don't know what your locus is. We've got Ed Sheridan from the Gazette, and we've got Mario, who is IT support.
Ben, can I just notify you've also got Councillor Sharman, who is chair of the audit committee.
Thank you, Councillor Sharman. I didn't spot you there. Thank you very much. With that, then, I will then move on to number 2, urgent items, order of business. I haven't been notified of any. 3, any declarations of interest from any members, please?
No.
Thank you. So with that, then, I'll now move on to the substantive item for today, which is the call-in decision of decision NHQ47. This decision was called in on the 26th of May of this year by Councillor Odds, supported by Councillors Levy, Klein, Papier and Steinberger. It relates to the Cabinet decision of the 18th of May in respect of restricting residual waste to introduce fortnightly collections for residual waste to street level properties using black 180 litre wheeled bins. Councillor Odds has notified 2 grounds on which he has made this call-in. Those 2 grounds are as follows. Firstly, in making its decision, the Cabinet failed to consider relevant evidence. And secondly, that the decision taken was not in the interest of the borough's residents and a preferable alternative decision could be adopted. Those are 2 grounds under the Constitution which a councillor, a backbench councillor, can call in a decision of the Cabinet. Now, I've been notified by our legal team that the call-in member may not seek to introduce an explanation based upon reasons other than those given for the call-in decision, e.g. other than those 2. In other words, the call-in member is limited to explaining why the Cabinet allegedly failed to consider relevant evidence, why the decision was not in the interest of the residents, and what alternative decision would have been preferable. The way I intend to conduct matters is firstly for Councillor Odds to make his representations on those 2 grounds, and then after that to let the Cabinet member, Mr. Burke, and Councillor Burke, and then the officers make any response they feel appropriate. And then following that, I'll open it up for questions. And then at the end, the members of this committee, and we are quorate, the 3 members, myself, Cllr Conway and Cllr Coban, we have one of 3 decisions to make. And just so you all know, they are either take no further action, in which case the decision has immediate effect, to refer the decision back to Cabinet for reconsideration, setting out the nature of the panel's concerns. Cabinet must then reconsider the matter, taking into account those concerns before making a final decision. Or thirdly, to refer the matter to full council if the panel considers that its recommendations would have an impact on the council's budget or policy framework. So those are the 3 options. And I say this to Councillor Conway and Councillor Mette, the test we have to apply in making at the end of this is whether the scrutiny panel feels a preferable alternative decision should have been taken. So when we're hearing the representations and the grounds and the replies, what we have to focus our minds on is whether we as the scrutiny panel feel a preferable alternative decision should have been taken. So that is essentially the test. So with that background, can I then open it up, please, to Councillor Odds to elucidate on those 2 grounds. Councillor Odds.
Thank you, Councillor Hayhurst. Good evening, everyone. This decision is one of the most absurd that I've ever come across. It totally ignores the results of the consultation, which was quite clearly against it, and so it is not in the interest in that decision alone is not in the interest of the borough residents because they don't want it to happen. I find it very peculiar that the Cabinet has made this decision without any hard evidence whatsoever, let alone ignoring evidence. They haven't taken into account any evidence because there is no local evidence. It's all surmise and statistics, which is not evidence as far as we're concerned. If you look at the Cabinet report, the Cabinet decisions on item 9, or in the report itself, item 5, the reason the details of alternative options considered and rejected. There are no alternative options down there. There are 3 paragraphs which just refer to the RRP, and say that they need to make a reduction in waste. They don't detail any alternative decisions, any alternative options. There are alternative options. The main one, of course, being to encourage recycling rather than punish recycling.
Councillor Odds, RRP stands for Reduction and Recycling Plans. Just for
Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's fine. I just want to make sure everyone's following.
Yeah, I'm one of the first to complain about abbreviations. Sorry about that. Yeah. The Cabinet might not have been aware, but there have been various attempts in other boroughs, in other places in the country, to do this sort of thing. And they've all been spectacular failures. In Salford and Bury, I have a letter here from 3 councillors, 2 from Salford and 1 from Bury, who themselves went along to the recycling plants after Salford and Bury changed to 3 weekly black bin collections, and found that because the residents were having so much difficulty getting things into the rubbish bins, that the quantity they had was far too much. They were concentrating on that rather than concentrating on what they were putting in the recycling. And although statistically the amount of recycling collected went up, the vast majority of that recycling was actually contaminated because people were putting things in the recycling that should not have been in recycling. So in fact, the effective amount of recycling went down. When Haringey introduced 2 weekly rubbish collections, straight afterwards it was quite obvious there was dumping on Craven Park Road and other bordering roads of Haringey. This is something the Cabinet should have taken into account. It's evidence they should have realised. We don't want this. It's quite clear that encouragement of recycling, incentivising recycling, is far preferable to punishing people for not recycling. The carrot is better than the stick and is more effective. And it's my contention that this has not been considered by the Cabinet. The other item is the equalities impact assessment, which they considered. I find it very peculiar that in that it only considers very few. They mention various communities. They don't mention the Turkish community. They don't mention the Polish community. There's a far larger Polish community within the borough than there is a Orthodox Jewish. They don't mention the Alevi community. Why are certain communities picked out and not others? It's very peculiar to my mind, and it seems to me that they have failed to consider all the evidence, because there are certain, as I say, certain communities missed out of the equalities impact assessment. And one way or another, this decision will have an impact on the council budget. Whether it's to increase costs because of the initial costs of extra bins and people to go round, or in the long term, if it were successful, to decrease costs. Either way, it will have an impact on the budget. And for that reason, it should be considered by full council, not by the Cabinet. Anything budgetary, so the Cabinet did not take into account that there will be a change in the budget, and therefore it's not within their purview. It's quite clear that, as I said before, the majority of people responding to the survey, to the consultation, which in itself was one of the largest responses we've had, which itself says did not want it. So I don't consider that the Cabinet have taken the borough's residents' best interests under consideration. And if people don't want it, it means that it's not in their interests. I rest my case.
Thank you, Councillor Odds. Just before I ask for a response, I think I've summarised. I've got your points down. Can I just seek clarification on the points, the sub points I've got, just to assist everyone that hopefully the officers can reply to individually. And I'm just paraphrasing here. 1, ignoring the consultation. 2, lack of hard evidence that presumably it's in the interest of the borough. 3, the lack of alternative options at part 5. 4, failure to consider specific other places where it hasn't worked. 5, issues to do with contamination. 6, to do with equalities impact assessment and some communities and groups are not represented. 7, that if it's budgetary, it should be decided by the full council. So they're the sort of the 7 headers that I've got, and that I'll ask the officers if you could please assist us as much as you can in responding to those 7 specific areas that have been raised. So who would like to kick off from the officer side?
Do you mind if I hand you over to the author of the report, who's the expert in the waste management, and that's Sam Kirk, if that's possible?
Thank you, Mr. Richards. Yep, Sam.
Hi, could I just ask for clarification on point 3? I took some notes, but can I just to make sure?
The point 3 was Councillor Odds was making the point that in the Cabinet report at section 5, he was making the point that it's sparse on what the other alternative options were in the Cabinet report, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3. So essentially, what other alternative options did you consider, and why is it so sparse in the Cabinet report? Is his point.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I would just like to go through to say the reason that we've actually put forward the recommendation to move to fortnightly collections is actually driven by a number of factors, both national, regional and local. The government published its resources and waste strategy, and within that the country itself has got to meet stretching recycling targets, which are often made harder by trying to improve recycling in urban areas. And that is one of the key points in the resources and waste strategy. They also talk about better recycling collections and also putting forward separate food waste collections. I'll come back to the reason why I'm mentioning that. Then there is the Mayor of London's environment strategy, and local authorities need to be in general conformity with that strategy. And again, the stretching targets within that, of which, as we've got to be in general conformity, we've got to contribute to the London-wide target. And we put forward with these changes that we could contribute to 31%. The other drivers on a more local level is that we want to improve recycling performance, but we also need to reduce the amount of residual black bag waste that's being incinerated. And this will future-proof the council against the expected rise in disposal costs in the medium to long term, which will arise from the necessary construction of the replacement incinerator. And it's also an important step in mitigating against the impacts of climate change and contribute to the council's actions following the declaration of the climate emergency last June. For Hackney, the expected outcomes is that we would see a reduction of 4,400 tonnes of street level black bag waste. We would see a reduction in the disposal costs of £246,000 per annum. We would see an increase in the recycling rate, and we'd also see a reduction in emissions associated with incinerating black bag waste, which could indicate a benefit of around 2,900, possibly 2,600 of carbon dioxide equivalent savings. So the reason that we've put forward this is, as I've mentioned, we've got to be in general conformity with the Mayor of London Waste Strategy, the Environment Strategy, and we've had to produce a reduction in recycling plan, which is why that section in the Cabinet report refers to that. Within the Mayor of London's Environment Strategy and the subsequent reduction in recycling plan, there's a number of elements that we've got to we had to put actions against, and one of those was restricting and reducing the amount of waste, and the other was around maximising recycling. Now, Hackney's got a really comprehensive recycling service already. We collect all of the main materials that the government is advising and will be potentially legislating against. We already collect those in Hackney. We already offer everybody, including those on estates, a food waste service, and we offer a free garden waste service. So there's the things that other local authorities would be putting in their reduction in recycling plans are probably increasing the amount of materials that are recycling, introducing food waste, and possibly introducing garden waste.
Sam, can I just stop you there for 1 minute? I just noticed Councillor Ette's just joined us. Councillor Ette, I think I gave your apologies at the start because I was under the impression, perhaps wrongly, that you were conflicted or predetermined because you had taken part in a prior decision or looking at this issue. Now, that could be incorrect and you may not have done, and it may just have been apologies for lateness. Can you clarify, Councillor Ette?
Yes, that's true, Councillor Ben Hayhurst.
Then in that case, I think, because I need to protect the integrity of these proceedings, and so I think because the other councillors who have been what's called predetermined are not on the are not in the meeting, I think I probably just to try and keep everything above board and beyond reproach, can I ask you to leave, and then if you want to watch it, if you watch it via the live stream, is that okay?
Excuse me, Chair. Excuse me, Chair.
Yep.
Councillor Berg, I don't believe, can you just confirm, I don't believe that Councillor Ette participated in the task and finish group associated with residual waste restriction. So I'm not certain that's entirely correct.
No, that's true.
Fine.
I did not participate. Sorry, I didn't get that question. I didn't participate in the tax and finish group with regards to that. No.
Fine. Well, that's cleared up that issue. Now, there's one further issue. Tracy, I see your hand. Hang on. There's one further issue that you weren't here at the start of the meeting when Councillor Odds made his representation.
Okay.
And so it's not fair to have an equal meeting for you just to hear one side and not the other.
That's fine.
And so unless our lawyer who's here tells me otherwise, I think it's probably best that you don't take part in the meeting, but just for absolute 100% impartiality, you leave the meeting and you watch it on the YouTube link, and then we maintain integrity.
Okay, thank you. I'll do that.
Thank you
very much.
The lawyer nodding. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right. Sorry.
The GLA's requirement for. We produced the reduction and recycling plan, bearing in mind that there was little options left for us to meet the GLA's requirement for.
Sam, I've got a frozen Sam. Has everyone else?
Yeah, she's frozen on my screen too.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll just give it a second, see if it unfreezes. If not, could one of the other officers maybe just text Sam and ask her to log out and log back in again to see if that assists? Thank you.
I'll give her a call now.
Thank you. Have
So are
we?
we waiting
Has
for
anyone,
some?
have we? Anybody made any chance to make contact with him? Hang on, I just had a message.
I think Alex tried to
Sorry,
get.
I'm phoning at the moment, trying to get through to a mobile.
Fine.
Hey,
Okay. Well, in the absence, then, I mean, I was prepared to leave it a few minutes, but could I ask one of the other officers maybe then to take over, and then if Sam is back, she can join us.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just give her one more call.
Fine. Okay.
I'll try to continue as best I can to go through the report. Unfortunately, I'll need probably to hear some. I'll just go through what she first said. In terms of the options which the council is faced with, previously their service does offer all of those services which Sam has indicated. And we've got a very, very robust educational and encouragement regime in place. There is very, very little else that we are able to do unless we do some service changes. So the report made it clear that the only service changes which would get the recycling rate up to the 33 to 36% required was the implementation of the fortnightly collections. The fortnightly collections has been successfully, Sam's back.
So, I'm so sorry, everybody.
Don't worry, Sam. Somebody more competent than me can step in. I'm just explaining the service changes which we've already implemented and the options. If you want to continue with that.
Okay. Well, at what point did people lose me? Because I was talking for a while, and then I might have to turn my camera off because my connection's not good.
I think, Sam, you were explaining the existing service which we have and all the other things which we've exhausted and why we fortnightly collections are the other option.
Right, okay. Really sorry about that, everybody. If people don't mind, I'm going to turn my camera off so that my connection's a little bit more stable. Okay. So, yeah, so we've introduced all of those services so that it leaves us with little left to do other than restrict residual waste. And what we've actually done is, alongside looking at the other options that we could have done, we've also looked at what other local authorities done. I'm not quite sure whether you heard me say that, so I do apologise if I'm repeating myself, but we have looked at what other local authorities have done in London and elsewhere, and local authorities that have increased their recycling, have introduced fortnightly collections or restricted residual waste elsewhere. The consultation was a part of the reduction and recycling plan, and we had the results of the consultation back. Alongside the consultation, we did a comprehensive equalities impact assessment, and under the Equalities Act, local authorities have got a duty, and we've got to have due regard and eliminate direct and indirect discrimination and make reasonable adjustments. And in making reasonable adjustments, what we've looked at from the feedback from the consultation and the main concerns from the consultation that people had were around smell, health concerns, vermin, people rummaging through bins and overflowing bins. We've put in place, or will put in place, assisted collections for those people that would be struggling to move bins for various reasons. Large family policy, so for those that think that they can't cope with the 180 litre bin, they can apply for a large family policy, and as long as that they can show that they're recycling everything and all the food waste, then we will give them additional capacity. We are also making sure that we've got unlimited recycling of food waste, and it's important to note that these will remain weekly. Some other local authorities, and again this is something we looked at, some local authorities actually go alternate week, so recycling is 1 week and refuse is the other week, but we're keeping recycling weekly and food waste weekly. We have also trialled, and it's proven that we've got FOX-proof food waste bins. So whereas we know that there's been problems before, and there's been issues with vermin and foxes knocking over food waste bins, we've sourced some that are lockable and foxes can't get into, and that would address a lot of the concerns that people have raised throughout the consultation. And it's worth noting that those top reasons were across the board from everybody. There wasn't any particular group that had something different that they raised concerns about. We're also making sure that, should this go ahead, that we do a comprehensive communications and engagement plan. And that will be generic across all households affected, but we also want to engage with particular groups, especially those that might be more impacted than other groups. So in terms of, I think a point was made around dumping. We've also done quite a bit of work to make sure that we've learnt lessons from other local authorities, and we're taking those on board, and I suppose that's the benefit of us not being the first people or first local authority to introduce fortnightly collections. But we will make sure that street cleansing levels remain as they are. I know a lot of other local authorities have had to make cuts in their street cleansing services, but we know that we don't want this to impact on the street scene. And we're looking at having an enforcement team, behaviour change team, that have got enforcement powers. So those people that are seen to be dumping on the street, we can follow that up with enforcement, an enforcement strategy and process. The other point I wanted to make was around, I think there was a point made around incentivising people to recycle. I think, as I outlined earlier, we've done a lot, and we've got a very comprehensive service. Back in 2015, we had a waste composition analysis done, and 54% of what was in the black bin should have been in the recycling bin or the food waste bin. Another piece of work that we've done alongside this is to look at our heaviest collection day in terms of waste tonnage, and we've done a further waste composition analysis, which has shown that 69% of what's in the black bin could be in the food waste bin, or it could be in the recycling. So unfortunately, people aren't recycling what they should do. Hackney's also had a local Green Points incentive scheme, and it hasn't shifted the recycling rate as much as what we would have hoped. And we're not the only authority with this issue. This is across the board, and recycling rates have been flatlining. So we have to look at the options that will actually see a shift in the recycling rate. Yes, contamination is an issue, but again, along with this process, we're working with our materials recovery facility, BIFA, to look at where contamination is currently. We want to encourage residents to put the right thing in the right bin, and we will continue to do that through this process. I think I've mentioned about the equalities impact assessment. The reason in the actual in-depth equalities impact assessment, rather than in the Cabinet report, we do mention other communities, but they weren't identified as having specific issues. And also that in terms of analysing the response, there wasn't as many people responding as there was for the Haredi Jewish community that responded. So that's why there is a lot of mentioning there. We just didn't get the feedback from those other communities. However, we know that we need to engage with those communities, and we will do. And earlier on today, we had a meeting with JCC, and we've spoken to them, and they've also spoken back to us and said that they would like to work with us, with the community leaders, to see how we can actually implement this should it go forward. I think I'm hoping that I've actually covered everything there. I'm happy to take further questions. There has been a substantial amount of work done, but I think the key thing to say here is that there will be a large family policy in here, and there will be assisted collection. So we've thought around a lot of the issues that came up within the consultation. So although only 39% agreed, a lot of the concerns that were raised, we feel that we've put in reasonable adjustments to actually tackle that. The last point was around the budget, but I don't know whether Alid wants to come in on that point.
The budget, it doesn't require full council. There are decisions every day which does have financial implication, but the report clearly outlines the financial costs, the capital and the revenue costs of this one. So the Cabinet had made the decision with all the facts in front of them.
Thank you. So now I think it's the opportunity, we've heard both sides, for me to open it up to questions for those on the scrutiny panel. So either Cllr Coban or Cllr Conway, do you have any questions? I mean, I can kick off with a few, or Cllr Conway.
Yeah, I had a question. Thank you both to Sam and Councillor Odds for your presentations. You both mentioned that there are examples of other councils that have adopted this scheme, and you both actually make reference to there having been issues with these schemes. I'm just wondering whether we could have any examples from you, potentially, Sam, of scheme of any councils that who have had huge success with this, and or at least do you feel that we're confident that we are addressing the issues that have been raised by these other local authorities who perhaps haven't had as much success with the scheme?
I mean, I haven't got the figures for every single council that has introduced fortnightly collections, but the reason that fortnightly collections have been introduced is because it does increase recycling rates and it does reduce overall residual waste. In terms of recent success stories, Lewisham Council introduced this about 1.5 years ago, I think it was. At the time, their recycling rate was 17% and it's now 28%. So it shows, and as for Lewisham's fairly similar to Hackney, especially in the north of the borough. And there are another number of local authorities, such as Southwark, that have got fortnightly collections. I have to declare an interest with Lewisham. I actually used to work there, which is why I off the top of my head, I know what their recycling rate was prior and what it is now. But it is evidenced that local authorities that introduce fortnightly collections, and the top 30 performing authorities in England have fortnightly collections, and the ones that with lowest the lowest recycling rates haven't got fortnightly collections.
Thanks, Sam. Can you just? I know Councillor Burke wants to come in, and I also see a hand from Mr. Ali. Sam, can you just give me the figures for Lewisham again, please?
It was 17% prior, and they I think it was October 2017. I think that they rolled it out, but their recycling rate, published recycling rate for last year is 28%.
28%. Right. In order, I had Councillor Burke who wanted to make a comment, and then Mr. Ali.
Just on this specific point, Chair, for the purposes of clarification, I think it ought to be noted that fortnightly waste collections are by no means uncommon in the UK, and in fact, more than 2/3 of England's local authorities already operate a fortnightly waste collection, or indeed less frequently. Of the top 30 boroughs or local authorities for recycling rates in the entire country, all 30 provide as a minimum a fortnightly waste collection service, and of the bottom 30 local authorities for recycling in the country, all 30 provide a weekly recycling service. And though that in itself is not conclusive, it's a highly suggestive piece of data indicating the efficacy of residual waste restriction on diversion of recyclable waste into the recycling waste stream.
Thank you. Mr. Ali?
Thank you. I was just going to, Councillor Burke's just said what I was going to say, really, to reinforce that point. That, you know, I've worked in other local authorities, and where I've introduced changes to collection services, and it has worked very successfully. Indeed, in the area that I live in, there's fortnightly collections, and it works well. And these schemes work well where you've got other forms of collection, so that, you know, alternative recycling, food waste, glass bins, and paper, and so on. So as long as you've got other means of collecting waste, then it works perfectly well. And if you look at the papers in the pack, and which Sam's also alluded to, the exercise that was done just does show that a large amount of volume in receptacles is taken up by things like plastic. So a lot of space in bins is taken up by plastics. And if people were recycling those things that they could recycle in alternative sources, that creates a lot more capacity to be able to provide smaller residual bins for residual waste.
Thank you. Other Councillor Coban?
Yeah, my only I guess, like, I think I'm broadly sort of supportive of you know, Councillor Burke and sort of what the administration is doing. The only sort of like the point that I wanted to draw to, and just to sort of, because I've been in discussions with the mayor I think even before he became the mayor, I remember sitting in meetings to him talking about our efforts to sort of increase recycling efforts in Hackney. And obviously, like, when you look at the respondent demographic of the consultation, you could see that, you know, overwhelmingly, obviously, it's more of a sort of a white population who's obviously have responded and is sort of engaged with this process. And, you know, obviously Hackney's got a very diverse population, and obviously it'd be good to know a bit more about how could we encourage sort of that recycling option for ethnic minorities from communities that you know, tend to not sort of or how we're going to better communicate with them.
We're currently writing a comprehensive communications and engagement plan. So again, this is something probably different from local authorities that I know and have worked in previously, because we want to do a really comprehensive engagement plan as well as just doing the bog standard communication. So yes, we will send out leaflets and everything, but we also want to run focus groups with people just to find out what is stopping people from recycling. And it might be the fact that certain communities, the way that they purchase items means that they haven't actually got a lot to recycle. But for those that aren't recycling, what's stopping them? Some people might not even know that we've got a food waste service. And so as when we're doing the communications anyway, and moving forward, we will be encouraging people to get a food caddy, but we will definitely be engaging, running focus groups and engaging with those representatives. And like I say earlier on today, we did have a meeting with the the JCC, just to see how we can actually help people move through this process with us. And we're open to suggestions as to who we could work with in the community, but we're definitely going to be doing a lot more engagement than what other local authorities have done. And we've had feedback from Labour Group and from LPG and from other groups with some really good ideas as to how we can actually do that. So we're putting together a comprehensive communications and engagement plan to ensure that we get this right and help people.
Councillor Coban has your hand in.
Yeah, Sam, that sounds great. And I think the only thing that I'd add to that is it would be great if we can go back to some of our previous efforts to obviously increase recycling. You know, like for example, in the estates when we're locking down the chutes, for example, to encourage people to recycle more. And it would be good to get a better understanding of, you know, why are those behavioural changes not happening in the sort of the rates that we'd like to see happen. So, I mean, obviously focus groups and stuff are good, but the danger is, if I'm honest with you, especially in the particular climate of the sort of COVID-19, is we'll end up talking to the same people that we only have contact with and that we already know. So the big question is how do we end up talking to people who, you know, are ordinarily not going to engage with the council process and are ordinarily not going to probably sort of be to recycle. So I guess, as I say, look, I'm really supportive of what the work that you and the team and, you know, Councillor Burke's doing to sort of increase recycling efforts, and obviously that's something that we want to see happen in Hackney. But, you know, I think there needs to be a bit more thought process around how we can engage with communities that don't typically sort of engage with these processes. And, you know, as I say, I appreciate that, you know, these focus groups and everything, but I've heard this a lot before as well, and, you know, on the back of it, not a lot has come. So it'd just be good to be a bit more innovative with our thinking around that.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Appreciate that. One of the organisations that we're working with is Resource London, and they've got behaviour change people working for them, and we're talking to them about how we can do it. And next month we're testing, and with social distancing and everything, testing different ways of engaging with people. And one of the, as was highlighted in the Equalities Impact Assessment, one of the groups that's really hard to engage with is the 16 to 24-year-olds. And so we're testing a different way of working and running a webinar, like online event, to see it, which is specifically targeted at those people. So we're working with behaviour change people to see how we can do it, and we'll do that with other groups as well, because I agree, we can't keep on like preaching to the converters or getting people who we ordinarily talk to. We do actually have to make this work, we have to talk to everybody.
That's great to hear, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Comment.
Yeah.
This is slightly off topic, but whilst we have Councillor Coban in the room, I would be most happy to go through with you the work that we've been undertaking on estate recycling, and given the disproportionate overrepresentation of people from minority ethnic groups in council housing in Hackney, I think you would be pleasantly surprised by some of the results we're yielding from that programme. There have been some instances where we've taken estates from an 11% recycling rate to a 25% recycling rate. So I think the potential is absolutely there to engage with those groups, but I think we're all alive to the fact that those harder to reach groups do require more work in order to bring estate recycling levels up to the same parity as those of street recycling.
Yeah, and just to say, sorry, I wholeheartedly agree with that, Councillor Burke, and I think that's exactly my point, which is how can we learn from the other sort of like initiatives that we've made, and that's great to hear, and hopefully it's a similar results for this project as well.
Councillor Odds.
Sorry, problems with technology. I'd like to come back on what Councillor Burke said earlier about the top 30 and bottom 30.
Please
and
do.
Out of recycling. As I pointed out, certainly in Salford and Bury, a lot of that recycling, it's measured at the roadside. But by the time it gets to the recycling centre, they discover that a large quantity of it is contaminated because of the non-weekly rubbish collections and people having to stretch themselves as to what they're getting into their rubbish bin, and not concentrating on what they should or should not be putting in their recycling. I quite agree that we need to push up the recycling rate. I don't disagree with that at all. And the other point was just mentioned about estates. This initiative is not addressing estates at all. So I think we have to find some other initiative that's really outside the purview here. I just, you know, although the estates were involved in the consultation, and I think you'll find that if they were taken out, if their figures were taken out of the consultation, the majority against this proposal would be even higher. But that's just a minor point. But as I say, the major point is a lot of this recycling is dependent on how it's measured, and a lot of it is measured at the roadside and ends up being contaminated, which actually costs the council money in terms of being fined for contaminated recycling. Thank you.
Apologies, Chair.
No, John, Councillor Burke, I want to take this in turn. There's 2 points here, and I want to try and get direct answers to both of them. First of all, I understood that, and then I'll let you come in afterwards if I haven't covered it. My reading of the Cabinet report was that the consultation just went out to the 41,000 street properties, not to the estates. Can someone just clarify that particular point? Or have I got that wrong?
Yes, no, that is correct. It went out, and we in the consultation itself, we actually asked people what service they were getting, and in the Cabinet report, it's only based on those people. All of the analysis is only based on those people that were from a street level property.
Fine. And second point, before I let Kat.
Chairman, sorry, I apologise for having to intervene. I've noticed a note from Cllr Coban indicating he'll be reconnecting on another device. So technically, until he does so, we are not quorate.
Fine. In that case, then I'll.
So
He's back.
So sorry about that. I had low battery on my other device, so.
Fine, thank you. No, sorry, we just had to, because we weren't quorate until you were back, so just out of fairness. Just Councillor Coban, just so there's any avoidance of doubt, Councillor Odds made 2 points. If you left during that interval and we were getting a reply, the 2 points he made was that one, the statistics of collection, is that done at roadside or is it done actually when it gets to the recycling depot, and actually when you take out a lot of the contaminated waste, the percentage of actual increased recycling goes down? So there's a question there which the officers have yet to respond to. And then the second point was that he thought the consultation went out to people on estates, but Sam has clarified that to say that it didn't. It just went out to the street properties. So can I now ask Sam to respond to the second point that Councillor Odds made, in terms of, if we take, for example, where you've previously worked Lewisham as an example, the increase in recycling increasing from 17 to 28%, was that done on a roadside collection basis? And how did you work out how much contamination was in that 28%?
Yes, it was, but I'm going to talk in general terms rather than Lewisham terms, because every single local authority has to report their waste data. So that's all of our waste data, everything that we collect within the local authority, we have to report it to DEFRA. It's an in-depth, complicated system that we use called waste data flow, and recycling rates are based on the percentage of household waste that is actually recycled. So yes, whilst we might collect a certain tonnage, that does get reported, but what also gets reported is when we take it to the materials recovery facility, the amount of that waste that is contaminated. And that doesn't go towards our recycling rate. That gets put back onto the amount that's incinerated or the amount that's landfilled, depending on the local authority waste disposal route. So when you're talking about recycling rates, it's only talking about the material that is actually recycled, either at the materials recovery facility or at the reprocessor if it's source separated.
So Sam, can I clarify with respect to the top 30 local authorities and the bottom local authorities, what data set was that based upon? Was that based upon roadside collection data set, or was that based upon the DEFRA figures at the recycling facility?
All local authority recycling rates include everything that is recycled. So the majority will come from household recycling. Most of that, depending on the local authority really, but most of it will come from street level properties. Recycling on estates is notoriously harder. You tend to get lower rates, but we don't have to report on whether it's comes from a housing estate, whether it comes from a street property, whether it comes from the reuse and recycling centres. So it's all lumped together as one recycling rate. So going back to Lewisham, yes, Lewisham introduced services, but the only thing that changed in that time was the change in services, and the fortnightly collections were rolled out. With Lewisham, slightly different to Hackney, because they didn't have a food waste service. So a food waste service was put in at the same time as doing fortnightly collections, but the recycling was kept weekly. But when you're reporting the recycling rate, it encompasses everything that the local authority recycles in terms of what's classified as household. So that could be waste from a household waste and recycling centre, for example.
But does that strip out contaminated waste?
Yes, it does. We cannot include contaminated waste, because once we collect the data, we get data back on a monthly basis from the materials recovery facility. For us, it comes from North London Waste Authority, but every local authority gets data on how much was contaminated. Now, what might happen is that it doesn't even hit the recycling figures in that way, because it will get rejected at the materials recovery facility and we have to send it to incineration. But no local authority data, when they're talking about their recycling rates, will include contaminated data, because it gets stripped out and it gets added on to the incineration, the amount that's incinerated or the amount that's landfilled. And Salford and Bury have both got 3 weekly collections for residual waste. and Salford's rate for 2018-19 was 46.6%, and Bury's was 52%. But that won't include any of the contamination that would have been collected. That is purely the amount that's recycled, and it also includes, you know, the food waste and garden waste as well. That's all included in the recycling rate.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that clarifies.
No,
sorry,
that does.
It can be complicated.
It makes the basically, if I've understood it correctly, in a nutshell, contaminated waste is stripped out.
Yes, that's right.
Of the analysis and the evidence base that you've applied to this.
Yes.
And whether you're likely to get an increase in recycling rate.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a few questions then? Just in terms of on the cost situation, have I got this right? In total, we're budgeting for possibly up to a £3 million rollout, comprised of two 1.5 million chunks. The spend to save analysis, just on a financial term, leaving aside the other issues, is that it's around £250,000 a year. So we're looking at a 12-year spend to save plan if we were just looking at this on a financial prism. Is that right?
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. Yes, but that's based on current levy charges. The levy charges for building the new incinerator are likely to increase significantly over the coming years. So what we have to do is we have to mitigate against that, and hence putting forward the proposal, which is going to give the biggest drive to get material out of the black bin. And we've modelled a 31% recycling rate. We believe that that's realistic. But that isn't where our level of ambition stops. We want to try and drive as much out and increase the recycling rate, which will reduce residual waste, which will reduce what goes into the Edmonton incinerator, and will reduce overall cost, disposal cost.
So, fine, okay.
Could I just add a point, Chair? Which is that one of the other things that systematically minimising residual waste incineration does, quite apart from the obvious environmental benefits of eliminating close to 5,000 tonnes of residual waste a year from Hackney's waste system, in respect of financial matters, is that it reduces our future exposure to risk associated with the incineration of waste. It is quite recently, the prospect has been mooted in the corridors of Whitehall that incineration represents a good first opportunity to trial carbon taxation associated with an unpopular activity that government is seeking to minimise. Were that to be implemented at some point in the future, the cost associated with a failure to attempt to constrain the supply of incinerated waste from Hackney could significantly increase our costs further still. So one of the unknown financial aspects associated with the reduction of residual waste is the extent to which it reduces your exposure to significantly increased costs in future as a result of carbon taxation.
Thank you. Can I ask just a bit more detail about the large family policy? I think, Sam, you said something in your presentation that I hadn't quite picked up on from the Cabinet report, which was the criteria that would be applied for those applying for extra bin capacity. I thought I understood you to say, and I didn't pick it up, and apologise if it was me from the report, that the way that would be determined, the way the council would decide that you would get extra bin capacity if you have more than 4 people in your household. That's criteria number 1. But number 2 would be that the council would want to satisfy themselves that you are recycling everything you could do. So can you just say a little bit more about how that policy is going to work in practice? Are you going to have an officer going out to all those households, 4 or more that apply? How's it going to work?
So yes, when we start sending out information about the service changes, we some of the information will be service standard. So we will be setting out what our commitment is to the residents of Hackney, and likewise what we would like residents of Hackney to do to help us do that. We'll also set out all of those things that I mentioned, and once again, apologies, I'm hoping that I've put everything across. I hadn't realised I'd gone offline, but we'll be putting out all of those things to help people. So encouraging people to get fox-proof bins, assisted collections, and those sorts of things. Within that information, we will say that we have got a large family policy and people will have to apply for that. We're still working up how that would work. It's likely to be an online form, but appreciate that some households haven't necessarily got access to computers. So again, this is one of the things when we're doing the engagement, that we want to make sure that we get to everybody and make sure that everybody knows about these things. So it could be that we have paper versions of that and they get fed through to us. On some of the funding that's being spent on this, it will be for behaviour change advisors, and as I mentioned, that they will have an enforcement function as well. But it's in the initial stages of us rolling this out, they will be behaviour change. There will be educating people, door knocking, telling people about the new services, and at the same time talking through and doing assessments of large families. And it may well be, and we had this experience in Lewisham, where if you actually speak to people and explain what it is that you need to recycle and everything, actually, and talk to people about, you know, just see how it goes, see if you can manage, then a lot of people will be able to comply with this once they know that food waste and recycling is weekly. For those that are still struggling, we will be prepared to go out and speak to households and actually talk to them, show them what they can and can't do and everything. And we will want them to make a commitment that they will be recycling their food and recycling. And if that can be demonstrated, then we can give additional capacity out to those people.
But I mean, obviously, the issue there that I suppose it's obvious, and I think you're aware of it, with overcrowded households, of which there are a number in Hackney, that might also be coterminous with those that are on the wrong side of the digital divide. And clearly, on accessibility, I think you've really got to make every effort to make people aware of the large family policy for those that are genuinely entitled to it. I would be my observation in relation to that, because otherwise there's an obvious unfairness for those that are living in overcrowded households. Yeah, and we will do that. We also want to work, you know, with landlords as well, so we can get, because the HMOs are going to be a potential area where people might need additional capacity as well. So yeah, like I say, the comprehensive engagement that we'll be doing beforehand will hopefully mean that when we come to actually launch the scheme, people will be aware of what they need to do and what we're doing to help make reasonable adjustments for those people that need it. Are you giving out the fox-proof bins in the same way that you're going to give out the 180-litre black bins, or is that something that you have to
not we what we're doing is ensuring that we are have got a stock in for the uplifting people requesting it, and when we launched and undertook the consultation, I think it was around, we had about a 30% increase, I think it was, in people requesting bins. So we're making sure that we've got additional stock in place for when we actually launch, to make sure that when requests come in, and from whenever the decision is made, whenever we're going to start promoting recycling and food waste services. We've got digital screens on one of our vehicles. We've got other vehicles that have now got advertising on the side. So we've got mechanisms in place to start encouraging people to use the services now, so it's not quite as hard when we actually come to launch the scheme.
And would those fox-proof bins, would you have to purchase that, or would that be given?
No, we'll give them, but people just need to request it online.
Fine. Okay. I think I've exhausted. Councillor Conway, Councillor Mette, Councillor Coban, do you have any further questions?
No.
No.
Councillor Conway?
No.
Right, well then it's then come. Right, it's then come to the out of fairness, Councillor Odds, have you got anything you want to say in final reply before we make our decision?
Yes, sorry. Yes, I do actually. Going back to what Councillor Burke just said about the possible taxation of carbon emissions, etc., etc. Whilst I quite realise that part of his task is future gazing, what he said is coming into the realms of speculation, which I don't really think we can totally take on board at this point, or should. You know, whilst obviously he has to make plans for it. I don't think it should affect this particular policy. Okay. And coming back on the large family policy, certainly in the Haredi community and also in the Muslim community, there are quite a few families that will have 3 children under the age of 5 in nappies, and that is going to be a big strain on this sort of reduction in collection of waste. Having dirty nappies in a bin outside your door for 2 weeks is not going to be pleasant. And I think that's something that has to be taken into account. Say it doesn't only apply to the Haredi, the Muslim community, but probably more so. So obviously that's going to be, you know, a hard one to deal with. And I really do want to emphasize that particularly the Haredi community do not use social media. They don't, the vast majority don't even have computers in their house, don't have smartphones. And, you know, if we are going to implement this, which I hope we won't personally, but that's for the decision beyond me, we really do have to realise, I mean, Sam just said that the Fox-proof food bins have to be applied for online. I hope that was a slip of the tongue, and I hope that a telephone request will be sufficient in that sort of thing. We've got to change our mindset and respect those people who do not want to use technology in the same way that most of us do.
Thank you, Councillor Odds. I want to wrap this up, but just, I mean, I don't think I need to enter into discussion on the carbon tax points, but I do just want Sam, just briefly before me and my colleagues move towards the options decisions available. Sam, can you just briefly come back on whether the Fox-proof bins can only be applied for online, or whether there might be other opportunities or mechanisms to apply for that, and B, on the nappy issue, please?
Yeah, apologies, it was a slip of the tongue. Yes, of course, people can phone, and throughout the rollout period, we're making sure that we've got additional contact centres, staff, just to pick up if people do use telephones and everything. So we've got additional staff to actually cover that. So my apologies, that's a slip of the tongue. In terms of the nappies, we have also contacted other local authorities to find out what they have been doing, and the general rule that local authorities have applied with fortnightly collections is not to have additional collections for those in nappies. There is the additional capacity that we're there, and that should accommodate that. In the consultation, nappies was only cited as a concern in 7% of the respondents. But it is something that we would have to keep under review if it is a particular issue in a particular area.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. So with that now, everyone's had their final say and the opportunity to respond. So to Councillor Conway, Councillor Coban, can I just go through the, reiterate the 3 options, and then any discussion amongst ourselves before we make the decision? The 3 options are to take no further action, in which case the decision will take effect immediately. So that's option A. Option B, to refer the decision back to Cabinet for reconsideration, setting out the nature of the panel's concerns. Cabinet must then consider the matter, taking into account the concerns of the scrutiny panel before making a final decision. Now, if we wanted to go down that route, I understand the test is that we think there's a preferable option available to the one that's being presented. And then the third option is to refer the matter to full council if the panel considers that its recommendations would have an impact on the council's budget or policy framework. Do you have any, Councillor Conway, Councillor Coban, do you have any observations or thoughts or discussion on which of those three options you're thinking about?
I'm happy to go. I'll go.
For
Sorry,
me, it would be the first
Sorry,
option.
can I take one at a time? Sorry, Councillor Conway first. Councillor Conway?
For me, it would probably be, based on obviously what I've read, but also what I've heard this evening, it would have to be option A, because I can't, given that this is a viable opportunity for us to, you know, there are clear examples of this scheme increasing the amount of recycling in various different boroughs around the country, quite a significant proportion of boroughs. I can't see where the alternative is, what the reasonable alternative is. So I just don't, I can't see how it's possible for us to even consider the other two options on the basis of what we have in front of us at the moment. So yeah, it would be the first option for me.
Councillor Coban?
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with Councillor Conway. I think, you know, I think so. I mean, I'll be opting for option A, which is to take no further action and to roll it out and start immediately.
Thank you. I've gone through, I've listened to the points that have been made, and I'll just go through. I would also go for option A. Councillor Odds, in terms of the points you outlined in your presentation, I'll just go through my sort of thinking so you've got clear responses to them. In terms of point one, ignoring the consultation, I think whilst the responses of a consultation, of course, need to be taken into account, that can't always be the over factor, and it's got to be weighed in the balance with respect to other points. Here we've got guidance coming from the government, from the Mayor of London, and there are clear other countervailing interests in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, increasing recycling, and a spend to save process over the medium to longer term. In terms of your second point about evidence, I think we have heard about how in a 2015 study there was 54% of material, of recyclable material in the black bags that shouldn't be there, and 69% in another study. We've also heard how when stripping out contaminated waste, those local authorities that have the best recycling are those that have fortnightly collections. In terms of your third point about there being no other options available, the officers with expertise in this area and a lot of experience feel this is the only viable option to increase it to increase the level of recycling. And I also note, by reference to other areas such as Bury, Salford, they could have gone for 3 weeks. They haven't. They have opted for 2 weeks, which is itself a process of going through the options. In terms of other areas that you've mentioned, Salford, Bury, as has been pointed out, they are on a 3-weekly cycle, but has also been pointed out there have been high levels of recycling there. In terms of contamination, we've heard that the figures we've been getting have had that stripped out of the analysis, and so notwithstanding any contamination that may occur, there still shows to be increased recycling. In terms of the equality impact assessment, clearly a lot of work has gone on in relation to that, in particularly the large family policy. I agree with you and the observations, and I think we've had assurance that needs to be clear mechanisms of communicating that and making that accessible to all residents, in particular those without digital devices. And so I agree with your observations there, but I think it's sufficiently robust. And we also heard from the officers about why certain communities were not referenced in the cabinet report. Is because they didn't make a percentage number from that community didn't make significantly enough for it to be notable within the Cabinet report. And in terms of your final point, in terms of budgetary pressure, this isn't something that requires to come to full council, and there are many decisions that the council makes in a similar vein. And if we sort of referred it or took a different decision on that basis, then the logic would be we're referring all sorts of decisions to full council, which isn't how the structure or the constitution works. So we have listened, I have taken note of all those points, have been some very valid discussions, but for all those reasons I agree with Cllr Coban and Conway for option A. It's therefore, unless there's any dissent, we're all in agreement, it's option A. That means options B and C fall away. And I don't know, do I just need to, for the record, can I just take a vote then? All those in favour of option A, can you just raise your hands? Councillor Coban, can you turn your screen on, please? Councillor Coban, are you there?
The device I'm on right now, the video camera doesn't really work. So
fine.
Can I just?
Can you confirm orally that you agree with option A?
I confirm, yeah, that I agree with option A.
So you voted for that. Fine.
Thank
so
you.
That's a unanimous vote on option A, and therefore that is the decision. Unless the lawyer who's present tells me I need to do anything else under this procedure, I'll then move on to any other business.
Chairman, if you wouldn't mind, you do have recommendation 2.1, which is just a noting point in any event, just to note the advice given under the terms of the report by the monitoring officer and section 151 officer, that the decision taken by Cabinet was inside the Council's policy and budgetary framework. So I would be grateful if you could just note that for the resolution.
I'm prepared to note that. Councillor Conway and Coban.
Noted.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Then with that, I'll bring items. I'll thank everyone for your attendance and for the discussion and thorough questioning of this important issue, and thank everyone for their contributions.